Good evening. I want to begin first by saying some names. Muhammad Dawood, Khudayad, Nazar Mahmood, Payendo, Rabina, Shatarina, Zahra, Nazia, Masooma, Farida, Palwasha, Nabia, Ismatullah, Fazullah, Isa, and Akhtar. 16 names. 16 names of the people who were killed in the Panjwali massacre just weeks ago when a United States sergeant ran through an Afghani community and just shooting people at will. 16 people whose names have been disappeared by the media and are almost impossible to find. 16 people who the United States would have us believe were just killed by a lone gunman and not as a result of a decade-long occupation. Now, some of you may ask, what does this have to do with the tar sands? Everything. Canada exports over half of its oil, over 750,000 barrels of oil every day to the United States, making it the single largest foreign supplier of oil to this country. The Pentagon, which is the United States imperialist arm, is the largest institutional user of petroleum in the world, and it uses 395,000 barrels per day. So, 750,000 barrels every day goes to the United States. 395,000 of those is what fuels the United States Army. It is that same oil that fuels the Canadian Army. It fuels the bombs that are dropped on Afghanistan and Iraq. It fuels the planes and the trucks that carry the United States soldiers into combat and into the killing fields. The children of working class families that have been the fodder for this war all got to Afghanistan and Iraq fueled by the tar sands. Now, if you look at oil sands productions on a calendar for the last 20 years and notice the peaks and the drops, you can almost write the history of war in the so-called modern world. In 1978 was the second tar sands mine that was opened. This was 5 years after the OPEC crisis, which happened after the United States government supported Israel's military aggression and forced investors to start pumping money into Alberta, thus beginning the destructive process we've heard about. In 1979, again, the production peaked, this time because of the Iran-Iraq war, which was being waged when the United States government was supporting Saddam Hussein, who later turned out to be their enemy somehow. In the mid-1980s, oil sold for $20 a barrel, and oil sands production was happening because it cost between $18 to $23 a barrel to process tar sands fuel. In 1998 and 1999, the cost of a barrel of oil was about $12, and oil sands, and this was the time when the United States had full control over the Gulf because of the first Gulf War, and again, tar sands production actually fell. And this was what the case was until 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq. And over a couple of months, the price of oil went up to $35 a barrel. This is from the, $12 in the in early 2000s, barely 4 years before. And as soon as the price of oil hit $35, the United States Energy Information Administration discovered oil in the tar sands. It announced that Alberta, previously thought to only have 5 billion barrels of oil, was actually sitting on 174 billion barrels of oil. The next year, Canada overtook Saudi Arabia as the largest provider of foreign oil to the United States. We're talking about a vicious cycle here, where wars by the United States government and its allies, including Canada, go ahead, destroy communities around the world in the search for oil. And often, that search for oil is fueled by the oil itself. And what it results in is more oil production. It goes around and round and round. Now, there are two things to remember about war. One is that war is extremely profitable, which is why it happens. And second is that the war is happening both at home and abroad. Let's talk about profits. We know that Canada gives about $1.4 billion in subsidies to the oil corporations that we just heard about today. But what we don't know is that Canada has decided to invest $480 billion into the Canada First defense strategy over the next 20 years. That's billion with a B, To put this into perspective, the net projected deficit of the federal government at this point is about $500 billion, approximately the same amount. Now, where is this money going? This money is going to build new warships in Halifax and in Vancouver. It's going to go into buying the F-35 jets. Military bases have been announced in Jamaica, in Kuwait, in Germany, in Singapore, in South Korea, in Senegal, in Kenya, in Tanzania. These are Canadian military bases. And all of this money, essentially, is going into the pockets of constructions and armaments corporations. And it's going, of course, into the oil companies that are actually connected into every one of those industries. It takes petroleum to build construction products. It takes petroleum to build armaments. The United States spent $700 billion, that's in 1 year, unlike $500 billion in 20 years, on arms last year, just on its war machinery. Now again, most of that money went to arms companies, went to construction companies, and as I said earlier, the Pentagon being the largest consumer of petroleum, it went directly to the tar sands industry. Now, that's the direct profit from the war machinery itself. But the real profits actually happen when corporations can swoop in and feed off the regions like Iraq and Afghanistan, which are now living under NATO occupation. The Afghanistan and Iraq war, like most other wars, have given multinationals a free ticket to gobble up resources, seize firms, take over resources, and in some cases pay a paltry 1% royalties to the governments they're in. And just to be clear, just like the production of oil destroys the climate, the war itself, the war machinery itself, fuels that is fueling this is destroying the environment. So according to the World Watch Institute, emissions from military operations, just military operations, account for 6 to 10% of global air pollution. Okay? So that's a huge amount of global warming is actually a direct impact of the wars that are being waged. Right? So there's two levels of climate destruction. First from the actual extraction of the fuel, and then from its consumption. So we often hear about how there are resource wars, climate change is going to cause greater conflict. But what we don't hear about is that climate change is actually a result of the imperial wars of aggression that the United States, Canada, and the NATO countries are waging. More climate change means more profits for the corporations that are then flying in as charity, as development organizations that are trying to then fix the situation on the ground. More wars means more profits for the warmongers and the oil companies. And as we see that the global economy shrinks, wars increase, climate change exacerbates, more and more people, particularly poor and people of color, are being pushed out of their homes. The United States Congressional Research Office estimates approximately 3.5 million Afghanis are currently dislocated. 3.3 million Iraqis are also searching for asylum abroad. Now these numbers make up a small portion of the 45 million people that are displaced around the globe, primarily by war and climate change. We're expecting that by 2050, in about 30-odd years, that the actual total number of displaced people in the world is going to hit 200 million. And at the projected rate of population growth at that time, that'll mean 1 in 45 people around the world will be directly displaced by wars, that's the tar sands, and by climate change. And so what happens to the people that are displaced? These are migrants that are forced to find jobs in the Great North. Across Europe, Canada, United States, we see immigration being shut down while more and more people are coming in on temporary work programs. In other words, the very people that have been dislocated and displaced by decades and centuries of colonial and imperial wars, when they arrive at the doors of the countries that are responsible for their displacement, they are pushed to work for the very corporations that are profiting from their displacement in this ironic, disgusting, frustrating place where you become then part of the next wave of displacement. The Petroleum Human Resources Council of Canada says that it wants to bring 130,000 new migrant workers to work on the tar sands and the pipelines. These are people who would have been displaced by the same wars that this is fueling. These workers will slave in deplorable conditions and pay into the Canadian pension plan and social welfare, but not access any of it. Like the old railways that crisscrossed this land, that crisscrossed Turtle Island, that were paved that were built by migrant workers, but paved the way for the colonization of indigenous land. We see that the tar sands pipelines are again being made by the sweat of migrant workers, again complicit in the destruction of indigenous communities. And the wars abroad. Now, at the same time, we see that Canada has doubled its rejection of citizenship applications, cut the refugee acceptance rate by 60%, its family sponsorship by 30%. But the number of temporary foreign workers is doubling. Deportations are on the rise. In the last 2 years, just $500 million have been put into the Canada Border Services Agency to give more arms, more money to the actual arrest, deportation of these migrants. And it's not just temporary workers. Current regulation, laws like C-31, if they pass, will mean that refugees, parents and grandparents, spouses and citizenships will all become temporary. Now, the exploitation of immigrants in the United States and Canada is the war at home. But there's an actual military battle that's being waged here, and it's being waged against the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. We are residents of a settler state, and its government will wage war with impunity against the same people whose land it's trying to steal. Now, there are many examples. I'll just quote a few. The Innu people of Nitassinon opposed low-level flights taking place of the NATO Air Force in Goose Bay. The resistance had started in 1979, and by 1989, 250 arrests had taken place in opposition to the military base on their territory. And it was only in 2008 that this Air Force base was closed. In 1990, 2,500 Canadian soldiers were mobilized against the Mohawks of Kanesatake, who were trying to stop a golf course from being expanded onto their sacred burial grounds. In 1995, the Royal Canadian Military Police and the military secretly moved into Secwepemc territory for a 30-day siege that included landmines, grenades, assault rifles, and hundreds of tactical police officers as Indigenous people held a sacred Sundance ceremony. This militarization is profitable, it creates climate change, and it is being fueled by big oil, and most recently by the tar sands itself. This needs to be stopped. Untangling the web of environmental racism, attacks on Indigenous sovereignty, immigration, climate change, and war is of the utmost importance. We need to form lasting relationships across struggles and movements, understand the connections between them. And what we need to do is we need to count our victories. In 2008, Chevron tried to expand its 3,000-acre oil refinery in Richmond, in California, a community where 46% of the adults and 17% of the children have asthma. Through a course of direct action and grassroots organizing, connecting all these very different anti-racist, environmental justice, anti-war, anti-oil, Indigenous sovereignty struggles, they were able to mount a resistance which actually pushed back a big oil corporation from building a refinery. We've seen a similar fight with the XO Keystone Pipeline. We know that the Inca Dene Alliance, which is working with over 130 indigenous nations, says that it has formed an unbroken wall from the United States border to the Arctic Ocean that will try and stop every pipeline, every tanker that will try to cross the north and south coast. We need to support that struggle. On May 8th and on May 9th, the Dene Alliance is actually arriving in Toronto to actually protest the Enbridge AGM that is taking place. And we have to make sure that we join them. Calls will be coming soon, and I urge everybody to notice them. We've heard today about Amjawang. We've heard today about what's happening in Athabasca. We've heard today about what's happening in the Niger Delta. A time has come. It is necessary for us. Inaction is no longer possible, right? Wars are being waged in the names of many of the people here. These communities that are under attack are under attack because there is a direct benefit, a direct profit, right? The electricity in this room could not work without the tar sands oil. It could not work without mining. It could not happen without the war machinery. We need to create systems and mechanisms now because we need to stop these pipelines. We need to stop the oil sands. We need to create real decolonization, to create respect for Indigenous sovereignty, and we need to do it now.